Okay, welcome to this monthly meeting of ISCAST, Perth chapter. So my name is Peter Thomas, and I'd like to welcome you. Is there anyone? Yes, there are two new people to ISCAST, so I'll give my little spiel about what ISCAST is. No, there's probably about 4 new people, I think. So ISCAST stands for the Institute for the Study of Christianity in an Age of Science and Technology. Bit of a long name, essentially Australian Christians in Science, with its head office in Melbourne, and so we are the Perth chapter. What we do is conversations at the intersection of mainstream science with mainstream Christian faith, be those conversations in schools, churches or academia. Basically anyone who's interested. And where do we stand? Well, we see no conflict between mainstream science and Christian faith. If anyone would like to receive emails about our future monthly meetings in Perth, there's a sign-up sheet on a little white table over there. Just sign up with your name and email, and you'll get the emails about future meetings. Our next meeting is Thursday, 7th November. Scraping the barrel a bit, it's myself speaking on dinosaurs, earthquakes and deep time, planet Earth on the front line of science faith. I'm trying to make it sound interesting, but I started life as someone interested in dinosaurs and worked in oil and gas, doing geology, geoscience, but I'm interested in all aspects of science and Christian faith. So hopefully it'll be interesting. And I'll email that if you're on the list. And then for early December, thinking of having a meeting which will be like a panel discussion with opportunity for people to ask all of their curly science faith questions. Haven't tried that before. Could be interesting. Could be a riot. Who knows? We'll let you know about that one. Okay, before going further, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, the Noongar Whadjuk people of Western Australia. And we have a little box over there on the white table for sort of small cash donations. That's entirely voluntary, but ISCAST Perth would like to do this as Mark there at the back, Mark Illingworth, and the team here at South Perth Uniting Church are welcoming us into this splendid premises for free. Thank you guys for your support and letting us meet here. So ISCAST is a Christian organisation, and we normally begin with a prayer. So let's open in prayer. O Lord our God, we thank you for the amazing, complex and beautiful revelations of yourself made available to us in the Bible and in nature, your handiwork. Above all, we thank you, Lord, for the resurrection of your Son, Jesus, and for the profound hope that it can bring to each one of us. We thank you for our speaker David's studies around how we know about Jesus' resurrection, and we pray that tonight will leave us all better informed, inspired, and closer to you, Lord God. Your name be glorified. Amen. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. David Graieg. Not the first time he's spoken at our meetings, but I'm going to read a little blurb about what you've done and what you do. David is a lecturer in Christian Studies at Sheridan Institute for Higher Education, an adjunct lecturer in apologetics at Alphacrucis University College, the Australian College of Ministries, and an academic sessional at the University of Notre, Australia. His PhD, awarded in 2022 from Sydney College of Divinity, was on Jesus' resurrection in early Christian memory, which is now published with Routledge, a book called Resurrection Remembered, which David hopefully will show us. Oh, it's that one there. Quite heavy, but boy, if you want to know about this topic, the answers are in there. So please welcome David to the front.
Yep, thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Especially thank you to Mark and Southwest United Church for having me as well. So that was, to me, sounds like a very impressive bio, and I guess that's because I wrote it myself, so thank you. But I think the reality to me is it may sound like I'm all these places, but it basically means I haven't got a full-time job, and so I'm happy and I'll take anywhere that would have me. And so that's why I do a few different places. If you want just, I guess most of us are probably from Perth, and so if you want to know, I grew up in Floreat. I went to Christchurch Grammar School. I studied electrical engineering at UWA. I worked in gold mining for a while, and then roughly a bit over a decade ago, I went to Dallas Theological Seminary to study a theology degree there. And then I've worked in lecturing to some degree sort of since then. And then, yeah, I mentioned the PhD, which is what we're basically looking at tonight. So you've got the handout there to give you the... Oh, sorry, yep. Got the handout there to cover that. It's got most, I think it has exactly what's on the slide, so in a sense, it's not like you have to write something down. If you preferred a electronic copy, if you go to the website whychristianity.org.au, it's a website I run, and it's also got that same stuff just electronically there. Yep. So I'm hoping to spend no more than about an hour, but I'm aiming for 50 minutes. We can definitely take questions as we go, but I'm basically just previewing some of the key parts from my book, from my dissertation. I sent Mark the slides, and it's roughly 32 slides to get through. There's another 50 slides, which is to say there's more, but yeah, not planning to go into too much detail and look at that. But anyway, I guess I don't know if anyone knows my background. If there's a question, if you want to ask, it's still been very formal background. So I haven't even mentioned my wife and 3 daughters, my family. It's a shame on me, but I don't know. We'll keep it formal and we'll jump into our topic. So we're looking at a memory approach to Jesus' resurrection. And so I guess the first sort of question is, what is a memory approach? And this is basically to say, in historical studies, there can be different ways of looking at history. And in Christian studies, or often what's been known as the quest for the historical Jesus, trying to find out not just what the church has believed and proclaimed and said, and what tradition might say, but who really was he in history. What's usually been done is what's called a criteria of authenticity approach. And so this basically said that there's certain criteria that should be used to say whether something's authentic or inauthentic. And this has been things like multiple independent attestation. So if we have 2 sources that say something and they're independent, that's more likely that it goes back to a historical thing. It doesn't guarantee it, but it makes it more probable. And they might say if a story is embarrassing, it's less likely that people made up a story that makes them look bad and stuff like this. And so the background behind my research was to say that that has been done for like 50 years. And I personally think that that's a valid way, and there's good things that can be said about history from that. However, that has also been critiqued, and people have said, just because something's embarrassing doesn't mean it's more historical probable or not. I actually tend to think this critique is wrong, but they've said, there are people who make fun of themselves and stuff like that, so we couldn't necessarily know, and we may not be able to know what was embarrassing for one culture and another time and place and stuff like this. So there's been people who've basically said that those findings haven't been useful. And with a PhD, you have to do something new that hasn't been done before. And so something that has been looked at in the last 20 years, its popularity has increased, as what's known as a memory approach. And there's multiple ways that people do it as such, I guess, with all that, but in general, it's basically to say, what do we know about how human memory works? And let's use that to study history. Because maybe there will be certain tendencies about memory that you can see in these historical accounts. One thing that may just assume upright is that this is a historical account, because if you use memory to study like Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings, that's not really going to be useful, right? It actually may say a little bit about the author's sort of short-term memory and how they're writing the story, but by and large we know it's not, you're not going to find Hogwarts and stuff like this, it'd be the wrong category. So some people may even object to that, and by and large then I would say that is not objected in mainstream historical studies about the Bible. So they would take it as historical events and that. There may be a mixture of history and not, but yeah, so by and large this is just saying that in general there's some history there, and then can we look at it so it's not that category. But if you thought it was a complete myth, then yeah, that would in a sense defeat this whole argument. But I would say that's a separate topic, and PhDs are narrowed, so I may footnote stuff that looks at that, but I don't go into that. So yeah, we're just saying then, what can we use about memory to study history? That's a memory approach, right? Sorry, I think if I don't press this enough, maybe it went to sleep for a moment. But I can do it. Yeah, thank you. Next slide then, thank you. Yep, and maybe just before we jump in, just sort of say, why does this subject matter? And so for the early Christians, like Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, that if Christ has not been raised, that the Christian faith is worthless and like people are still in their sins. And so this is to say, to the early Christians, this was considered important. And likewise then, for Christians today, there's lots of different beliefs held there, but generally, Jesus' resurrection is still one of those central beliefs. In fact, you could say Christians are those who think Jesus rose. There's been some manner or different ways of taking that, but in generally it's considered he rose bodily. Yeah. Why then the last point on this slide is saying why this also matters is to say, yeah, people have said that other matters haven't been useful at studying history, and so then I would basically be saying if the Jesus resurrection is one of the key parts of Christianity, does that mean that Christianity is doomed, or can something be said about a memory approach to it? So that was why it mattered and why I went into studying it. Yeah. Yeah, so thank you. I think I do need you to click the slides. Thank you. Yep. I can do that. Yep. Interesting. Every time you press it, I can feel the vibration, but it doesn't work at my end again. Yep. Thank you. So if we just ask, what is memory? Memory refers roughly to a cognitive capacity related to how an organism's past affects its ability to recall information or modify its behaviour. That's to say, it's something that's happened in the past and affects your present action or that. That's sort of a broad definition, because that would also include, you have memory to cycle. Also, you have memory of facts, like where you studied or where you were born and things like that. Yep. So we jump in, and so one of I think it is coming back now, that's on and off. One of the questions may just be, is memory reliable? And I would say that in general, this is a key question that people are going to hear, but it's really not the main one, which is to say there's several scholars in memory that would say that there's a book called Memory Distortion, which is to say how memory distorts, how it fails and has problems. And he writes this, although this volume is concerned primarily with understanding memory distortion, it must be emphasized again that memory is quite accurate in many situations. Therefore, the key issue is not whether memory is mostly accurate or mostly distorted. Rather, the challenge is to specify the conditions under which accuracy and distortion are most likely observed. So that's what we're trying to look at then, is to see that, are there things that we could say that is a mark of a reliable memory or mark of unreliable memory, rather than just sort of saying the blanket statement, memory is reliable, unreliable. I would say that the general sort of popular opinion, or even in sort of court cases and that, has been 20 years ago, that there are problems with memory, and that DNA in court cases evidence have overturned eyewitness memory, and so people have said you can't trust it as such. However, I would say there's a shift, like in the second point here. They've said that sometimes these are not problems of memory, but they're problems of how the questions have been presented to the individual. And we will touch on these in a moment, but I guess the idea would be, if someone asks the person who committed the crime, how tall was he? The very fact that you say how tall he was, as opposed to you just said what was their height, makes the person think it was probably a tall person and stuff like that. And so the sense in which that can sort of affect someone's memory of the event, it's like a loaded question, even though it may seem pretty innocent and stuff like that. That's been the case. And so the second point basically says that there's been studies of real life memory and events, and they found that a lot of stuff is forgotten. I think they say that 75% is actually forgotten. So you're only actually remembering 25% of sort of what happens in life, but it says of that then, it can be recalled with roughly 90% accuracy, which is to say it's quite well. And an example maybe, do you remember what you had for breakfast? And you maybe, yep. And so in some cases you may forget or not. And then you might say, well, yes, I remember today, but what about yesterday, the day before, and stuff like this? So these will all be questions that come up, but they're saying that, if you think you remember it, it's very likely that you do in fact remember it. So in general, my point would be, is memory can be quite reliable actually, but it's obviously going to depend on what. And so let's jump into that and look. In terms of the book, I cover 21 factors on memory, and so that's too much for us to look at there, which is partly to say if that's the factor that interests you there, by all means bring the questions. I'm happy to try to address them. But yeah, there are many other factors of memory as well. For instance, there'd be things like childhood memory, sort of more memory sicknesses, like dementia and stuff like this, which is not covered in here, but I thought these were the 21 aspects which were relevant to the study. And so we're looking at about 5 or so of them. Yep. The first one of which is transience. I'm sorry, this is going weird. Yeah. Yep. So transience basically refers to a weakening or loss of memory over time. And the idea is that, you can probably remember what you had for breakfast today, but maybe tomorrow, but probably not a week ago or a month ago, which it sort of fades over time. Yep. And an example then of how this may apply to Jesus' resurrection is we basically want to ask then, is when did this event apparently happen? And it's generally dated to either 30 or 33 AD. And then we would say, well, when are the documents that remain recording this? And so there are several documents as such. My dissertation actually only looks at 1 Corinthians, and the reason for that was basically because I write too much, and it was meant to cover the whole New Testament, but I guess I was too ambitious, and so having reached my 100,000 words in 1 Corinthians, it just stopped there. And then, again, why 1 Corinthians? It's probably the second or third earliest text we have on Jesus' resurrection, and it's pretty much the longest text we have. So depending on how you date Galatians, that would be the earliest, or some people may date Galatians later, in which case 1 Thessalonians would be the earliest, but they just mention it in literally like a verse, whereas in 1 Corinthians you have a whole chapter and another section, so you've got about 59 verses that sort of address and look at it, and so that's why I looked at that. And the point would be that's dated to about the 50s, so roughly 20 years later. You'd also have the Gospels, which there's a spectrum of dating of them. They would generally be, actually some people put like the Gospel of Mark in the 40s, but most would put it in the 60s. Yep, and then some of the later Gospels, some of which would also put it like John's Gospel in the 60s, but many would put it out towards 90 AD. And so the point is the Gospels are generally later, and so that's why I spent my study first looking at 1 Corinthians, and that's a key text. And so I guess the point would be, in terms of transience, is to say we've got a period of a couple decades, and then you can use what's known as a forgetting curve, and basically this is to say that how well someone remembers something is basically an exponential function, and it decays over time. And then particularly in the first 5 years, you find that the memory decays a fair bit. In the next 5 years, it's slower but still tapering off, and then basically it starts to get fairly consistent. Like if you've remembered after 10 years, you'll roughly remember the same amount 30 or 40 years later. And then they generally stop at about 50 years, basically on the assumption that most people don't live much beyond that, so you wouldn't have that. And then childhood memory, as I said, actually has some slightly different factors as well, which say if you were talking about what someone's earliest memories was, that, and I would say childhood memory is not relevant to this because we don't think that these were events that people witnessed as a child or they wrote it down as a child. So we're talking about stuff that they saw as adults and wrote down as adults. So that's that. But basically then, in terms of this forgetting curve, is basically saying for Jesus' resurrection then, it's roughly 2 decades later, which is to say there's sort of a spectrum of there, but it could be roughly 62 to 85% likelihood that it's remembered. And so depending how you look at that, you might say, well, there you go, it's more than 50%. So in terms of sort of the fading memory over time for 20 years, like that, you may say is not too bad, above 50%, but that may also worry you because you might say 60%, like that's pretty low. And so say this is just the first of 21 factors. And basically to say that that often assumes that you haven't been talking about it for 20 years. But if you actually have been, it sort of refreshes it in your memory, like learning a language or something like this. If you do it more, you're likely to remember it. It also assumes here that we're just testing sort of one individual, and the reality was there was sort of a group of this such that we could say what's Paul's memory, what's the Gospel's memory, and stuff like this, and this would make it more likely as well. But anyway, that's just the first factor. I don't know if there's any comments or questions on that one. Happy to keep questions to the end. You can sort of reflect and see the whole thing and see what you think. So the next factor, yep. Yeah, I've seen a couple different ones, and that is a key thing. And actually, if I'm being open and honest, that is to me in itself a worry. I feel like maybe if you're not comparing the right thing, you're not getting the right factor. And I think this one here is for people remembering how well in the US their GPAs or their grade point averages from high school, like 20, 30 years later, or 5, 10, 20 years later. So yeah, and what it has is, you might be saying, why are there different ones? Is it found that the people who say did better, which I'll just convert it to sort of the Australian system, you need these A, B, C, Ds, and like the US, the people who did actually get better grades were likely to remember it. But someone who got like the C or the D, it's like they had a weaker memory of it, but you still see that general pattern and trend for all of them over that time. And that's where I'm saying, like I say, 62 to 85, because it depends whether you think you've got like an A student or a C student. And they have done them for different periods as well, even like over a month, and then testing like 5 days later, 10 days later, and they found that exponential curve and fits that. There's been studies using like nonsense syllables, just like how well you could remember random letters and stuff like that. So they do have that. But yes, this is say if you look up common psychology textbooks on memory, they would use these. Yep. And then it's hard to find them for that longer period of time. And so this is the one I use for that. Yep. Yep. Yep, I very much agree, and I'm trying to say, I think I actually did state that curve is, if you like, is for everyday events, but you can have not everyday events, but things that are more significant, and that'll be one of the 21 points, which is to say, what's known as either personal event memory, or perhaps it sounds better, is called flashbulb memory, as for a significant thing, and yes, I think that would fall in that category, and so again, you would say if it was an everyday event, which I guess there's a whole bunch of Jesus' life, and so I'm not the first person to use memory to study Jesus' life. They've used it on whether Jesus was literate, whether Jesus used the term Son of Man. There's people who've done it on the Lord's Supper as well. But this was, as far as I know, the first study on Jesus' resurrection. But if you were asking like how well actually did the disciples remember, say, the story of the prodigal son, you may say that was like a pretty good story, so maybe that sticks in a bit more. But in general, that would be more like a everyday event, whereas I think Jesus' resurrection is not in that category. It's something, if it happened, it would have been really significant. And so that's a valid point. Another point we'll move on to is to say that memory is not necessarily passive. So there's different opinions of this. But traditionally, people have thought that memory is kind of like a filing cabinet where you can witness an event, put it in your memory, and later when someone asks about it, you take it out. And that's what could be called a passive view of memory. So it basically says that memory doesn't have many different effects on it, so that, what's put in is what would come out. So what's been more popular in the last 50 or so years is to say that memory is constructive, or to say it generates thing. And this is to say that it's like you think you put it in the filing cabinet, but the reality is you're pulling out a bit of this, a bit of that, and other things to reconstruct what the memory is when you try to restore it. And then, so the question then would be, how does that affect Jesus' resurrection? And actually, before I get to that, if you said, what do you mean by active or constructive? There's, I think, 5 types of this, and so I'm just listing 2 for sort of brevity. And so one is known as selection, and this is to say that only certain incoming stimuli are selected for encoding. That may sort of sound fancy, but it's basically to say that if even like with my talk, I'm saying probably too much, and so you're sort of selective in what you remember. You don't remember all of it, but yeah. And so the same with a memory, it's saying you don't remember the whole thing, but certain parts of it that. And they would say that's an active type of memory. Another one is abstraction, which is to say the overall message can be abstracted into some sort of core. Yep. And so if we just looked at those 2 factors and asked how would that affect Jesus' resurrection, I'd say that these studies have pointed out that there's different types of memory, which we haven't fully got into, and the 2 main categories are having episodic memory, and that's for events in your life, like a day at the beach. And then you also have, myself just trying to remember the term, proposition or semantic memory or propositional memory, and that would be like propositions, like facts, like I went to the beach. It's not remembering the episode and remembering the waves and what the sun looked like and the water and who you're with and stuff like that. It's just representing the facts. And so with regards to the active nature of memory, they have said that generally propositional memory isn't, someone has argued that it's purely passive, that propositional memory is not active, but it's passive. And my point would be here is in 1 Corinthians, so I'm kind of assuming you know a bit of this, so we've sort of skipped actually looking at the text of the Bible, which isn't necessarily a good thing. But for time-wise, I thought you might be interested in the memory parts of that. But half the book is roughly looking at 1 Corinthians, and half is like, what would the memory sort of mean to that? But in 1 Corinthians, you don't have, like in the Gospels, like the women went to the tomb in early morning, and there was like an earthquake or a young man, and the tomb was rolled away, or there's like soldiers, and they found an empty tomb and stuff like that, and that's like an episode of that. Rather, in 1 Corinthians, you have is what's known as generally a creed or a tradition, and it's basically then a saying, and it goes along the lines of that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and then he was raised on the 3rd day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to various people, like Cephas, which is probably Peter, the 12, James, and all the other apostles, and the 500 is mentioned there. And so they say that's a semantic propositional memory. And then the studies basically say that that is mainly passive. So I would say in that case, we don't have good reason to think that it did change a lot. But then you could ask then, how would this apply to the gospel accounts? And I would basically say that in general, you were right here that perhaps some of these appearances were just sort of selected, right? Which is to say there could have been more appearances, but just to say that memory, they selected certain ones. And that, if we went back to that early study that says, several, 3/4 of stuff can be forgotten, but what is remembered can be remembered quite well. So there's no reason to think then that had Luke selected, say, the memory of the disciples on the road to Emmaus having an appearance of Jesus, that is unreliable or that's fabricated or made up. Right, like, yes, selection could have gone in to how they remembered it, but it doesn't mean it's fabricated. It just means they selected it, and what is selected could very well be reliable, like as an example. There's several more that you could say about this, but I'm just picking a few, if that helps. Maybe we can pause on like each one. Any thoughts on that? Like, does that help on a passive, constructive views of memory and how that could impact memory of Jesus' resurrection? Well, keep moving. So, just to pause here and say, we're using a memory approach. There's sort of 4 main things, and I'm just highlighting actually 3 on this slide, of how a memory approach can be used. And this is to say, some may use a memory approach to say, assuming this happened, how likely has this been remembered, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean it did happen, but then you could study that, given that it was, like how well would someone remember over time, right? That's sort of one use of a memory approach. A second one is to say you could compare if we've got different views about what actually happened to Jesus' resurrection, like was it just a lie? And you could compare how well people remember a fabrication, a lie. Another one is to say maybe it was some sort of hallucination, and then you could say how well do people remember hallucinations. A third one would be that Jesus didn't actually die, but he just sort of swooned and fainted on the cross, and then, the disciples encountered then a Jesus who wasn't actually risen, but just revived. And I guess you'd be asking like how much of a memory impression would that make? Or you could say it was a resurrection bodily event, and you can compare which one of those is more likely to be remembered. And I guess the point made already that if you've actually seen someone who had died and back, like that would be like a shock, as opposed to fortunately people lie all the time, and often our lies aren't that memorable, and then it's often you forget, you get caught out and stuff like that. And that would then you'd ask does the Gospels bear marks of that more than others? But I'm just saying different ways of memory approach can be used. A third way is to say that given what we have, what is the best explanation that gave rise to these memories, right? And this is sort of just different ways you can use a memory approach. And the fourth one, it doesn't say the fourth, but it says social memory can basically just say how do people remember this event. An example of that may be with Anzac Day. We're not being removed from the first Anzac Day landing, so we don't have genuine sort of historical memory of that, but we can have how society remembers it. And the reality is it's sort of remembered in different ways. There's people who celebrate people's giving their lives and sacrifices to have freedom and protection for the country and family and that. There's other people who see it as military violence and stuff like that. And this can be how society, the social memory does that. So there's sort of the 4 ways, but I'm just sort of highlighting that as how you can use this in a memory approach. And the point would be is because in the next one, it says there are these different theories of remembering, of which there's 4, and we're just going to look at a 1, which is known as the epistemic theory of remembering. And this, is a little bit technical, but it basically says for someone to remember something, it means they had to know it. Right? And then so we say, what does it mean that someone knows something? And then in epistemology, the study of knowledge in philosophy, you have a standard definition of knowledge. And it's to say knowledge is justified true belief. And, sorry to be technical, but basically says that what is a justified true belief? It means that a subject S, like a person, knows some proposition P, if and only if 3 things. 1, the person believes that P, believes the proposition. 2, the proposition is true. And 3, the belief that P is justified for the person S at the time they believe it. An example would be, actually, with the darkness and my eyesight, I can't actually make out clearly enough what is on the time on that clock. It looks, and so you basically have to say, I believe, and I guess this is a real test of knowledge then. You can see it is is that 7:40? Oh, yep. No, it's I think I'm reading the hands wrong. It's probably that. And you have to see, and you have to say, do I actually believe that? Because maybe, I guess, maybe, I don't know how well you can see. I should have got someone else to call it out. And the question is, do you trust, do you believe that statement? Yep. And then the question is, would it be true? Because, if I have misread it, it's too dark, I got bad eyesight or something like that, my statement that it's 7:40 could in fact be false, right? And then the question is, are you justified to believe it at that time? The idea would be, was it a reliable circumstance in which it was said? Was it too dark? Was the person saying had bad eyesight and things like that to be able to make that out? And so the same thing would be basically said then of Jesus' resurrection. And that's what's applying this is to say this, that did they actually know that Jesus rose, right? And did they believe it? And I would say in the gospel accounts and 1 Corinthians, like Paul, it seems that yes, they did genuinely believe this. We've not misunderstood their intent or something like that. They seem to be claiming that, yes, they really thought Jesus rose. So that's like proposition one. They believe it. The second proposition, is it true that Jesus rose? And I would say here, there's going to be a whole mixture of opinions, which is to say there'll be people who say no, Jesus didn't rose, it was a lie, it was a hallucination, it was just a swoon, like he's coming back from fainting, but yeah. And the people say yes, no, he did really rise. And so I would admit that there are different opinions on this as such. Yep. And then you have to ask, were they justified in believing it? And so again, you're going to have to depend on perhaps you say, who are we talking about? But if we take about Paul, you're basically saying on the road to Damascus, did he have an encounter that would be conducive that he could actually say, we could say, yes, he had good reason to form that belief. Because some people might have said that, maybe Paul says, like in Galatians, that you would even pluck out your eyes for me. And this is an indication that Paul had bad eyesight. And, when he got to Damascus, he was blinded. So, is he justified or not? Some people have said, maybe he had an epileptic fit, in which case he wouldn't be. And others have said, no, the people around him heard a voice, heard a sound and stuff like this, and he was changed by that. And you could say there's other people, in the Gospels, right? We do have on the road to Emmaus in Luke, they walk alongside, they see him, that. They also have in a room, they're gathered and Jesus appears, and so we have a group here and stuff like this and that. So you could, again, say it's justified. And I guess to say there are different opinions of that. I mean, I personally think that, yes, not only do they believe it, I do think it's true, and then I think they were justified in it. I guess if you go into more details, but why? And this is to say then that they once had knowledge that Jesus rose, and then now in terms of a memory approach to this, can we say that is to say then, now, if they had knowledge of it, can they remember it? And I'd basically say that's kind of what all these other factors go. And I probably should have put this one earlier, actually, in the thing, but it's a bit complicated, so it probably fits slightly better and somewhere in the middle. Is to say then, yes, could have they remembered it? Things like transience, things like the active, passive nature of memory, would that affect it? Yeah, but if so, if they had knowledge of it, I'd say yes, they could remember it if these sort of conditions have been met. Maybe I should pause there. Any comments or questions on that one? If not, we'll keep thinking on them and we'll see. Another factor of those 21 is a social nature or collective nature of memory. And so far we've been looking at individual factors like transience, the active, passive nature and stuff like this. But so this is a not individual, but a social or collective aspect of that. I would want to point out that the term social memory itself can be used in a few different ways, so just be slightly careful of that. I mentioned with Anzac Day, you can talk about just how society remembers it, or you can talk about the fact that both how they commemorate it, and I'm saying there's both a positive and a negative ways of it used in that. But yep. And so if we ask then, how would this apply to Jesus' resurrection? I'd basically want to say that, for instance, in 1 Corinthians, we had this creed we said, and I'd say this is not the individual memory of Paul. I mean, yes, as such, it has been written in the letter. I guess all memory, in my opinion, in my mind, has to come through some individual. We don't have some sort of group consciousness that produces stuff. As such, it's always the product of some individual author, although they can obviously be saying this is what our society says, but it's his opinion of it. And my point to be there is in 1 Corinthians 15, right, when we have this creed that Paul says that he's telling the Corinthians this is not something that he's saying he made up. This is actually what he is saying is the early Christian societies. It's their collective communal belief about what happened. So in a sense, we do have that as such. And then I guess with the Gospels, you do have, say, Mark's account or Matthew or Luke or John's. But again, this is not claiming in Any of those cases, with a possible exception of who you think the beloved disciple is, if you think that is John and the author, he's part of that category in there. But we don't have the account of the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, right? We have Luke in a part of that social memory, recording it down there. And so my sort of point there is that we do have that. We do have the social memory of this, and we do have, in a sense, the earliest belief. We don't the earliest texts in all these accounts, they don't say it was a swoon or something like this. They view it, understand it as that. Upon analysis, you might say, even though they're describing it this way, it is in fact something else. But I'd say the earliest account was that Christ died and rose again. That is what the earliest social memory of it is. A few other factors on the social memory is we can see that the first century had a variety of beliefs about what the afterlife entailed and what would happen. And what you find is that the Christian community started having one specific view. They weren't what you'd say the Sadducees would say, there's no future afterlife, people die and that's just it. Or you would have Philo of Alexandria, and a lot of the Romans would say that when you die, the soul escapes your body and goes to sort of a better realm, a better place. And we do see some of that diversity within the Jewish culture. And what we find is in the Christian culture, they are unified in that resurrection means a bodily thing. And they're basically saying, that's what happened to Jesus, that's what the promise is, what happened to you. And so what my point here about the social memory is, we're saying that society, the Christian society, had shifted its view from having this plurality to having one unified view. And sort of what's the explanation, what's the best reason for why this is happening, stuff like that. And I'd say a good one is that, they, as a community, had witnessed a bodily risen Jesus, and that sort of transformed their belief and understanding of it. There's more. I think I make 7 points, and that's sort of one of them. And sorry if this is, in some ways, this is hard for jumping from point to point. But that's one thing. So next one is to look at what's known as schemata, or basically say people have schematics on which they remember things. And Bartlett was an individual who's famous for having studied this, and basically say a definition then is a schemata are cognitive structures representing a person's knowledge about some entity or situation, including its qualities and the relationship between them. And I feel that's a bit vague, so this may be not the best examples, but sort of a schematic is when someone sneezes, you say, I bless you, right? Or another sort of schematic, maybe you could call the hero's journey. We know stories, they'll have the hero faces obstacles and difficulties, and they have to overcome them, and they eventually sort of triumph. And this is the schematic in which the story plays out. I've just got an example with my kids. If you're watching Disney Pixar's Toy Story 2, and it has Woody and Buzz Lightyear, and they're fighting Zurg, and then in this, I guess this is, I think, at least 20 years old, so if you've been spoiled by me, I apologize, but yeah. But when Zurg meets Buzz Lightyear, he says, I am your father, and I'd probably say all the kids as well, but particularly all the adults know that's, the schematic is Star Wars. They've ripped off Vader and Luke Skywalker and stuff like this. And so the question sort of is, what would be the schematic for first century Jewish people in the Greco-Roman world about the afterlife, right? What would they be expecting to sort of happen? Yep. And basically say that in the case of Jesus' resurrection, we actually are sort of given what the schematic is, which is, say, in 1 Corinthians 15, in this earliest creed we have, it states that Christ died according to the Scriptures and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, which is to say the Scriptures were the schematic that sort of affected that. The difficulty there then is we're not told specifically what Scripture it is. And as you read through the New Testament, there's more than about 10 or so passages that it could be. But if you look in them, you basically see the kind of trend, and it depends exactly which one you think it is at play here, but it is that there's basically hope that hope in God despite opposition. And so the schematic would be saying that, the faithful Israelites have faced opposition throughout history, and we're trusting that, God will vindicate them and stuff like that. And so my sort of question would be could that schematic explain just Jesus' resurrection? Like, is that in and of itself? And I would want to say no, it wouldn't likely. In fact, the schematic would probably have caused the disciples to think that Jesus is dead and gone, because they would say, no matter who you are, like, death is the end, and they will one day be raised, but not in the midst of history. So the sense in which I'd say the first century Jewish schematic about the afterlife, wouldn't explain a belief in Jesus' resurrection. So there's something else that would stand behind it, and I guess in my opinion, it may be because they encountered a risen Jesus, and that came to give them the belief, rather than them just sort of fabricating it from reading the Old Testament or that. Because, they would think like Elijah or something like that. Like, God maybe took him away, but he's coming back, but they wouldn't be claiming he was bodily risen there and then. I guess you might say, was he actually, were the first century Christians claiming that Jesus was bodily raised? And particularly from 1 Corinthians, some people say the Gospels, it's very bodily, like Jesus says, touch my side and see, and he says, do you have any fish? And he eats it and stuff like this. And people say, no, Paul believes in a spiritual body, right? And so I would say if you look at the latest scholarship, not just in my book, but last 20 years, most scholars, there's always different opinions on everything as such. But the majority opinion, I think there's good reasons to affirm, that a spiritual body means not an immaterial body, but a glorified body that's like empowered by God's Spirit. It's fit for a spiritual existence with God, which again doesn't mean like ethereal ghost-like, but the belief was that God and his new creation is a spiritual thing, which is to say it's not like unspiritual and immoral and stuff like this. And so, sorry, some of this I'm not covering, but I'd say that Paul still understood it as bodily, and that is the explanation, and it's not explained by this sort of memory schematic of the afterlife. Any comments on that? Yeah. Yep. Yep, no, that's a great observation, and yes, and I would agree with that. In fact, so not only, right, do you have like Lazarus and Jairus' daughter, and I think there's at least someone else, I feel like, but you also have Jesus predicting his resurrection on at least sort of 3 occasions, and you can say that could play into that. But yeah, in general, I would still want to say that what we see is that when the earliest Christians encounter the empty tomb, their response isn't, yeah, he said it all along. Like, of course. They were like, Mary in John 20 will like turn to someone there and say, assuming he's the gardener, and it's like, if you've taken away, show me where the body is. So yes, you're correct. It's not like a 100% case. It's like a matter of probability, but I'd want to say it seems that the cultural beliefs about death are still strong, such that despite seeing some scholars often call Lazarus and Jairus' daughter revivifications, which is to say they come back to mortal life expecting to die again, as opposed to a resurrection of a spiritual glorified body that conquers death and for immortality and stuff like this. So there can be some distinction, and this is more of a theological distinction rather than a grammatical distinction, which say the same term can be used, but let's see behind that. And so all that comes into play, but I'd still want to say like what we sort of see happening is this sort of belief is the one that drives it, of them saying it doesn't happen. And it's the same sort of with not only the women getting there, the men, like they'll hear that the women were told from a young man or an angel that Christ has risen, and they're like, nah, like that's crazy. They don't go there saying like, yes, of course he's risen and that. They're still sort of hard to believe. Again, in Luke 24 on the road to Emmaus, Jesus encountered those two people and he walks alongside them and he's like, what are you discussing? And they're like, are you the only one who doesn't know what's happening? And like, we thought this guy Jesus, he was going to be great, but women have even heard, they've said this. But yeah, like they're dismissive. And I would want to say it's that kind of overriding schematic of the afterlife that is just causing them to say like, it doesn't happen. We sort of looking back, I would say tend to think, yeah, of course they should have. And like it's the ending to Harry Potter and every other sort of movie, like Avengers, Marvel, Endgame, and stuff like this. They use like resurrections and stuff like this, but like for them, they really don't happen. And in the rare cases they do, it like with Lazarus or Jairus' daughter, it's not enough to like change that mindset. But I do think those are great thoughts. Even you comment about the Messiah or like the Christ. So the creed doesn't say that Jesus died. It says that Christ died. And I think there is some significance in that as well. I mean, obviously it's one and the same, Jesus Christ, so to speak. But which is to say there were lots of people called Jesus. And just because some random guy called Jesus, and there still is today, like in South America, lots of people called Jesus or something like that. Yeah, but this is to say it was the Christ. And the Christ died has all that significance of this is sort of God's promised anointed, the king, coming king. And that's to say that he died is of, just significance, and it changes. It's not just some random guy, but it's God's chosen. And so I think that's good, and you're right, there's not as many as we tend to think, but yeah, there definitely are passages of scripture that talk about sort of the Christ and the figure. Yeah. Yep. I do discuss a bit more of that in the book as well, but yeah, I like that point. So. Sorry, probably moving on for time, starting to talk too long. So if you want the next factor, I think this has gone to sleep while I've talked, so thank you. Is talk about memory distortion. And so one of the famous studies on this is with John Dean. And so you all might know this, but just to sort of even refresh my memory on this, is John Dean was the the White House counsel for President Nixon, during that. And so he had these conversations about what to do, and he didn't realize that the conversations had been secretly recorded, and so he testified in court, and then later these recordings were revealed. And so they have a case of what he said, how does that memory of the event compare to the recordings of it, so they're able to study that and compare that. That's this. That being said, because it is a legal court case in which you obviously would want to be trying to avoid guilt, there are other factors at play that can sort of affect this, but it's been well studied, and I think there's some of the insights that you can get from this, basically. Yep, and so how could some of that apply to that? So I guess I didn't say the point, I was just saying there is memory distortion. And there's several things that could be done, but one thing that was found was that his memory of the event was neither what they've said to be semantic, like describing the facts of that, neither was it episodic of like these particular accounts. Rather, they used the term re-episodic to describe the fact that he didn't actually describe any one like real conversation of what happened, but it was like a combination of the multiple conversations that John Dean had with President Nixon and that. So it's like he was literally wrong about what was said on this date and this or that, but nevertheless, on the whole, it was correct in the general sort of facts of it. And so I'm just saying that's like a case of memory distortion, and then how that could apply then to Jesus' resurrection is I would want to say this could mean, doesn't necessarily mean this, but it could mean that even if there was confusion about was it still dark, or was it early morning, or was it one woman or two women, or were there one or two angels, or stuff like this, that wouldn't necessarily then mean, based upon sort of what we know of memories and this sort of thing here, that the whole thing needs to be thrown out. There could still well be a core that could come about. Yep, and then I would want to sort of cheekily suggest that that basically is the creed of 1 Corinthians 15. That's to say, again, that Christ died, that he was buried, that he was raised, that he appeared to various people. That is sort of like, it doesn't have the details of where and when and stuff like that. And that is the core of what the early Christians believed, such that even if you thought there was sort of memory distortions in other factors and stuff like that, I don't think it sort of removes the whole thing, that you should say, no, the whole thing is just fabricated, made up, nothing. You would have a core of it. I feel like that was clearer and simpler than most of my other points. But any comments on that? Again, this is like not the only factor that could be said about memory distortion. I probably discussed like 5, and so I've just picked one, and I'm just going through to highlight some there.
I think the fact that there are those varying accounts in many ways really lends authenticity to it. In that if they were making it up, fabricating it, surely they would have all got together and got their stories exactly right.
Yep.
The same, so that there was no difference. But
Yep.
the fact that they were honestly writing down their recollections and shows that has that real truth to it.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, I agree with that point. That's good as well. In sort of legal cases then here, they would have that phenomenon, and again, so they're asking how good is eyewitness memory. And in general, they do not want, if there were, 4 witnesses to a car crash, they don't want the 4 witnesses to get together first and say, okay, let's get our story straight, what happened, who hit there. They want them to have an uncontaminated interview first. And I guess we're not in the position to know then sort of what happened there. So there's a sense in which you'd probably say at least the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Luke, are sort of seeing Jesus' story together that. And so most scholars think there's some sort of dependence there. But then, broadly speaking then, Paul is like independent source, John's an independent source, so you at least have it with that. Although, we can't say exactly where they got their facts and how we know all this, but and I do like your point. Moving on, just another factor, I think we've got 3 more to go, is what's known as, I guess, false memory, and the classic sort of studies are done by Denise, Rodinger, and McDermott, and just abbreviated to DMR. Yep. And so this is basically studies where they may give people a list of words, say, such as, I'm just trying to see my examples, but it may be something like bed, pillow, tired, like darkness. Yep. And then they ask people this is like a study done like laboratory settings, study an aspect, and then they ask people to write down what the words remembered, and then some people will write down the word sleep, but it was not there. And then so they'd say, you've got a false memory because of these sort of associations, right? And then so I would say, I guess I was already I was meant to be here, wasn't I? Explaining it first. So that's to say, you can have these examples, associations of that could cause a false memory, and then I'm wanting to ask then in how that might affect Jesus' resurrection. And so there's different factors that come into play here, and I guess the point here about other resurrections, about Jesus' predictions and whatnot could come into play. But similar to sort of what's said before, I would want to say, like, just in these lists, no one remembers like a hippopotamus. They may remember sleep, but that's because it has like these close associations to that. And my point would be, in first century afterlife beliefs, the truth is a bodily resurrection after 3 days is like a hippopotamus. It's not something that like anyone was expecting as such. And well, that's probably an overstatement. It was very unexpected, not completely unexpected, because yes, Jesus did predict his resurrections, but it's to say the disciples were, so unbelieving. They were wondering, like, what does this resurrection dead mean? Because to say they're expecting the Messiah to be victorious, they're expecting a general resurrection at the end, And, there was different opinions, like the Sadducees saying there is no afterlife belief. The Pharisees believe in a bodily resurrection, yet, at the end of the age. And there's people like Philo, a Jewish, who's like, no, it's our spirits and stuff like this. But by and large, no one is expecting that sort of bodily resurrection. And so I don't think that's a good, thinking it's just a false memory generated from that. I don't think that's a good or likely explanation of that as such. So that's just, so like I say, I don't think it's a good false memory to do that. Again, you might say there could be other things that could come into play in the account, but not just the overall thing, which is the main thing in 1 Corinthians 15. Kind of related to this is what's known as suggestibility, and this is the same memories that are implanted as a result of leading questions, comments, or suggestions. Yep, there's definitely some overlap there. And so an example of this, I would say that just firstly, in 1 Corinthians, it's a short creed, and studies have asked how much things can people remember verbatim, and there's been different studies, but it's around about 30 words, and to say that in the Greek, that is the length of the creed, broadly speaking, such that because it's short, it's not likely to have undergone sort of major corruption. There's even, some people think, some sort of rhyme, not in the phononic, the sound, like cat and bat, but just sort of the length. It has that Christ died for our sins, that he was raised, that he appeared, and things like this, and that's obviously in the Greek. Still comes out in English. And to say that this memorability of this would say it's less likely to be that. I would still also want to add that perhaps in terms of suggestion, we don't know how this went, but let's just say Luke was interviewing one of the women about what happened. If Luke said to the woman, was it still dark when you reached the tomb? That would be a case of suggestion where he's implanted a leading question into the person. They may say, oh yeah, it was still dark. And we don't really know what was, sort of interviewed and said and going through the accounts and that. So that's fairly speculative as such. But I would want to say the whole, if you said the question was, or an example could be, and that some people have said, is maybe the women got to the tomb and there was some young man who said, he's not here. And would that statement have suggested to them that that's right, he is risen from the dead because he's not here? And I'd want to say no, the suggestion in that cultural background again would just be, okay, if he's not here, where have you placed him? Let's go get the body. Doesn't it? It's not in retrospect that we're so used to resurrection that we would tend to think otherwise. So as such, I basically just want to say suggestion to me is not a good explanation for how the whole bodily resurrection thing came up, though it could have some degree, but it's speculative to say maybe the appearance of how many women were at the tomb and stuff like that. If the question was asked that way, that could give suggestion. But the suggestion just that, was Jesus raised, that wouldn't explain the whole thing. Any comments on that? I think I said 3 before, and so this would be the third, but I obviously have both bad memory or bad ability to count, because there's still 2 left, but this is the second last one. And so there's something known as hindsight bias, or just bias, and this is, so I guess just read the definition there. I've got my notes here, but I feel like it's on the slides. This is basically the powerful influence for current knowledge and beliefs on how we remember our past. Right. And an example of this I feel like I should be able to give. So I will just jump into, sorry, I'm trying to if I give an example of that. But the example, and I think we're about to discuss, sorry, there we go, thank you. It's not working as well as I like, there we go. So I'll let you do it. The next slide, please. One thing they've found in terms of hindsight bias is if people consider alternate explanations, this can help reduce their bias. So if someone has that, if you hear other people's opinions of it, could change that. And I would want to say, in ways, we have two accounts of way this can play in the New Testament documents. So one is that we see that the beloved disciple, he, after hearing Mary come and tell them that the body's missing, he ran to the tomb, although he got there first, but he stopped, and Peter, slower, but ran in and went that. And it says, Peter doesn't believe, and neither does Mary. They're just thinking, where's Jesus? Dead. And there's slightly different ways to take it, but it does say the beloved disciple says, he believed. Yep. And some people have said he believed Mary's report, but it seems more likely it's saying that he believed that Jesus was risen, and he had not yet seen the risen Jesus, right? And so there's a sense in where here now, he's come to believe, and so I want to say that's like a perspective, a bias of that. And so he then had not yet seen Jesus, and he's going to have Peter and others, and like we see, in a sense, the disciples on the road to Emmaus, not saying he necessarily spoke with the beloved disciple, but that community, they're saying, no, it didn't really happen. So he's exposed to these alternate viewpoints in which he had to come to see, was I wrong or not? And then the other disciples, in a sense, are opposed to his viewpoint that it is, he has risen, it's actually happened, and stuff like that. And then we see that they're exposed to the different positions, and eventually they get to sort of overcome their biases, and they all conclude that Jesus was indeed risen amongst the early Christian community. And that is just sort of one way I say it could come into play in those accounts. Yep. And so that's to say, then yes, in a sense, you might just say bias perspective can be negative, but we're saying sometimes you may be affirmed or confirm it. Yep, and that could be a case of it, how it didn't necessarily then distort or change the whole thing, but it helped those who were struggling to see it, come to see it, they overcome their sort of bias, and someone like the beloved disciple did hold on to it, was affirmed in it. So that's there, and then if you want the last one then, sorry, yep, thank you, Mark. Yeah, it's interesting, I think when you press it, it wakes me up, and then I'm pressing it, so I go 2 slides, but sorry, thank you. So yeah, this is the last factor I'm choosing to look at, and this is to say, I guess we already had it raised that we've been looking at sort of everyday events, but there also are more significant events. So these can be called flashbulb memories, and these are memories for the circumstances in which one first learned of a very surprising or consequential or emotionally arousing event. An example of this may include things there's a whole bunch, and there's some things that are both nice and not so nice. So I guess one of which is you may remember something like your wedding day and have vivid memories of that. Or sadly something like September 11th. Yeah, there's a tragedy, you can have memories of that. A few things to say here. They have done studies on September 11th and sort of gone past the 20th anniversary of that, so people have particularly wanted to study this. And what they found is, for those who were either not in New York and I know it also happened, outside New York, there was several plane crashes and one's in Washington, right? If my memory rusts on it. But in general, talking about the events, say, in New York, they'd say for those who are not in New York, they tend to think they knew exactly what happened, but less so. They've got sort of strong confidence in it, but they're not always accurate. But they found that for those who were in New York, they really do have a flashbulb-like memory of it. Or the other thing they found is, people who actually had family or someone known in the event, even if they were outside of New York, because of their associations they were. And they've similarly studied things like the NASA Challenger explosion, and again found that in general people think they know, and they think they have a flashbulb memory of what happened during that, but if they weren't actually part of NASA or something like that, they actually have confidence in it, but it's not necessarily the case. But for those who did work for NASA and stuff like that, even decades later, they can have strong recollection of these events. And so my sort of point and application then to Jesus' resurrection then would be, would this fit in that category? Is this that sort of everyday thing or not? And I guess quite clearly, if it had actually happened, you would say, yes, that would be a life-changing event. This is to say, the disciples had left behind their previous sort of life and occupation. They followed him for about 3 years, and they had thought he was going to be this Messiah who was going to lead them, and they were mistaken, they were wrong, right? They had followed, it would appear, like a false Messiah. And, there were two others crucified with Jesus, and the question is, like, who's going to be next? Yeah. Then, to see 3 days later, like, him alive, him risen, if that happened, I'd say that makes, like, a unforgettable, like, memory of the event. And that's kind of the story as it goes, that they went along talking about Jesus' resurrection, and they didn't talk about it just once, like 20 years later when they wrote it down. They're talking about it probably at least weekly, which say that they had weekly gatherings on the first day of the week, and they were talking. And like, at Easter we say, Christ is risen, he is risen indeed. I would say they were saying that like every Sunday, which is to say that's why it was on Sunday. It was no longer on the Sabbath, on the Saturday. And so I think this would create for those disciples who witnessed that. And to some degree, I'd want to say even the Corinthians, upon hearing this, like this would be like sort of a crazy, shocking claim to hear that some dead peasant from Galilee kind of thing has been made like Lord by God. God has vindicated him and said, no, he wasn't this blasphemer that deserved to be crucified by the Romans, but he's the one, he was, in a sense, the Son of God, the Son of Man, come, live and walk among us, and died for our sins and rose up. And so to say that message of the creed as well, I think that would create like a flashbulb-like memory of that sort of event for them. And I guess for us, we sort of live in this Christian culture where you've heard it, and so it's sort of lost its effect. It's no longer like a shocking story as such. But, yep. So that's on the whole. Yep. And so in general, if you want sort of my conclusion would be that, yes, there are many factors to consider, and we've only covered some of them. And not all of them are clear-cut. There are things that could suggest and to look through. But still, I would argue that a memory approach supports the conclusion that the early Christians would have had deep and lasting memory impressions of a bodily risen Jesus. So thank you for listening. I don't know if you've got any further questions or comments. Happy to try to answer some.
Thank you, David. That was really great. Appreciate it. I have a question about flashbulb memory. So you mentioned that the reliability of flashbulb memory can be variable. It's dependent on circumstances such as how proximal the person was to the event and so on. And flashbulb memories are often of public events, that the whole community is aware of. But there also seems to be some evidence that they can occur for private events that are experienced, just personally. You mentioned that flashbulb memory would support the creed. But given the creed includes the death, the burial, and the resurrection, is it one of those that you would associate with flashbulb memory, or would you say each of them independently?
Yeah. I guess you probably wouldn't think that the burial as such would have a huge standout, but I think the crucifixion, although you could debate about who was there, which say is the women and the beloved disciple. Yep, but I do think particularly the appearance to see a dead person back again, would, if that had happened, would just sort of blow you away, and so it would make that sort of flashbulb memory.
Yeah. And the resurrection appearances, I guess, would be part of the creed, that they could be experienced as flashbulb memories, would you say?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, yeah. Like for Paul, on the road to Damascus, that would be like a flashbulb memory for him. Yeah, again, like the disciples on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24 would fit in that sort of category.
Yep. There seems to be differing opinions on whether surprise is a key component of flashbulb memory, whether it's a necessary condition or not. The death of Jesus may not have been surprising.
Mm-hmm.
Would you know, given this was a sort of protracted event that occurred, the disciples were witnessing it, there's no big moment in which they would have been, you know, suddenly surprised. Would you say that's less so flashbulb memory? You're mainly associating it with the resurrection and the resurrection appearances.
Yep. Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. And I would agree with you in the sense that I guess for us, the idea of a crucifixion is very shocking. But for them, these were public spectacles that happen semi-regularly to say, like, don't challenge Rome.
Yeah. Cool. No, that's all from me for now. Thank you.
Yep.
Well, David, I've got a question. I'm not sure it's entirely relevant, but skeptics will ask, well, you know, there's memories and then there's fabrications. I mean, have you considered, or did you consider in your studies sort of, you know, evidence against sort of fabrications, or maybe that's just a big overlap with the sort of hindsight bias? Are they similar, or is fabrication a sort of separate thing which we can...
Yeah, so I had a final chapter in my dissertation that did not make it in the dissertation, nor is it in this book. And the basic reasoning was that people with knowledge felt that it made me look too conservative. But I have now actually had that written as a journal article, and it has been accepted, but it's not come out yet, but by the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, or JETS. So I did consider that, and I was going to say consent to, I think that's sort of publication. I don't know, I'm pretty sure I'm allowed to send the draft version, but basically, yes, I did look at that, and my thoughts would be that, yeah, these are these different options. And so the way the book reads is basically to say, let's study 1 Corinthians, and what does Paul seem to be saying? And so I would say he seems to represent it as it was a bodily resurrection event. And then so I say, what does the memory mean for that? And it's all these sort of factors we've looked at. And so that other chapter basically would say, well, not everyone thinks that I've understood Paul rightly. Some people might say, yeah, it was a spiritual body in an immaterial sense. I think they're wrong, and I go into some of why that's the case. But yeah, and so given that there are other explanations, that other chapter, which is now a journal article, discusses that, and fabrication is one of those options. And basically I'd say there are studies on how well people have remembered lies, and in general it doesn't fare well. But you mentioned how does that even relevant? And I guess, as I said, a memory approach can be used in different ways. And so it depends how you sort of treat it. If you say, let's assume that it was a lie, would say that's not remembered well. But if you assume it's a bodily resurrection, would say that could be like a flashbulb memory and it is remembered well. But that's like one use, and they may say, well, that's not the relevant use because it sort of assumes it. So I guess another way is just sort of saying, well, what we have, like what's the best postulation of it? And I'd want to say, again, I don't think the lie explanation explains all those accounts and those of that well, because we'd probably expect them to be radically different, because if people don't remember lies well, we would expect if we have a account in like Matthew, Luke, John, Paul, to be, like different lies that sort of come up. But the fact that they do have this kind of core unity, I think a lie standing behind that isn't a good explanation, because memory studies of fabrication say people don't remember them well. So that's, the kind of thing I'd want to say.
Yeah, I quite like the way that the memory model that you've described can help to describe those variations, but they weren't radically different, like you say, poorly remembered fabrications or something. Instead, it was more selective. Remembered one person or one angel or two, not the bedrock parts of the accounts. Those didn't vary. So it's sort of that distortion memory, the selective memory, can sort of help explain that. And like I mentioned earlier, if it was a well-constructed fabrication where they wanted to get every fact in line, then this is also a good argument against that kind of really strong conspiracy that had all these people writing exactly the same thing, and that would point more towards fabrication itself. So I don't know, it's an interesting sort of middle position that the memory model, as you described it, sort of helps to tally with the sort of variation in the accounts that we see. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. Yep. Yeah, in saying that, so this is the first time someone's used Jesus' resurrection, and doesn't mean it should be the last, so other people could have other opinions and insights on how it's done. Rob McIver, who was actually one of my supervisors, so yeah, he's used, I forget how many, but let's say 10 of these factors to study particularly what is it? I think Greek it's kyria, but basically means like short, pithy sayings of Jesus. Things like, the one that comes to mind I think is not a good example. I was going to say, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. It's like a short saying, but I feel like that's not the greatest example because it's a textually suspect passage. So maybe you should say something more like, blessed are the meek or something like that. So he studies that and some of these factors on there. But so if this is profitable, we'll see how scholarship uses it or not. And I think I mentioned with the criteria approach, I think just to you all 2 factors, multiple independent attestation and embarrassment. But yeah, there are people who have used 10 to 20 factors, but most of the time they'll be like, it's way too many, let's focus on these. So I'm clearly guilty of that, 21 factors too many. So I'm doubtful that many will follow in that route, but we'll see what happens. Yeah, I definitely went over time, so thank you all for listening. I'm happy to chat to you all individually later if you've got further questions, but might hand over to Peter, or...
I've got one more, maybe.
Yep.
If you can stand there another couple of minutes. I guess I'm just thinking of the term Chinese whispers. I don't know if you can call it Chinese whispers anymore, but so makes me wonder, so in getting the sort of facts of the resurrection and crucifixion and so on onto paper in the Gospels and so on, how many sort of people from those who witnessed the events, how many sort of exchanges of information did it take to get these down on paper? I'm not saying that very well. I mean, were the gospel writers talking to eyewitnesses, or
Yep.
or perhaps they were witnesses themselves in some cases? But I mean, what's your feeling on that?
Yeah, no, that's good. It's in Australia, it's probably elsewhere as well, but it's often called Chinese whispers. In the US, they call it the telephone game. So I guess that's the politically correct way of saying it. Yeah, and that is discussed in New Testament literature. Someone like Bart Ehrman, if you're familiar with him, who was a conservative scholar who, during his process, lost his faith and is now probably the most famous sort of critic of Christianity. So yeah, he says the whole, someone becomes a Christian, they tell their wife, they tell their kids, the wife tells the neighbor becomes a Christian, they go on a business trip and tells someone else, someone tells Mark and he writes it down. And so you're like, oh dear, if we, so if you're a Simpsons fan, I can't remember what it starts with, but they do the telephone game and it comes out with Purple Monkey Dishwasher. And so it's just this garbled thing. And yeah, so the idea is, oh dear, big trouble. And so the general scholarly response to that has been, if we study oral tradition, the guy called Kenneth Bailey says there's three main models for this. There's informal, uncontrolled tradition, and that is that sort of telephone game, and that's sort of wild and crazy. And they've said that's, in their opinion, there's all over the spectrum, but most, and like he doesn't argue, that's not the correct model. Then there was formal, controlled, which was like the Jewish rabbis, where there was set people, there's a set text, and it's done virtually verbatim. Yep. And there have been some who've argued that, but so Kenneth Bailey and someone like N.T. Wright, James Dunn has taken this middle approach, and they've called it informal, controlled. Oh man, I'm just going to remember which way. And they basically say that it is not like this sort of wild, crazy, or nor this sort of verbatim, perfect memorization. It's that. And an example of this would be like a punchline, a joke, and actually one of the ones I learnt when I was studying close to 12 years ago was, and like maybe this is partly American and it's a little bit more pro-guns, but they said, what did the BB gun say to the mummy, no, what did the daddy BB gun say to the mummy BB gun? And it was, we're going to have a BB. And the idea would be, is you can, and it's a terrible joke, I'm sorry, but I'm not good with jokes, but the idea is you could build up the joke in different ways, but the storyline is like well remembered. And so they've said that is the kind of model they think for the Jesus traditions. And so something maybe like, who do the people say that I am? Some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah. Yep. And then the punchline is, Peter says, you are the Christ. Yep. And I assume this may not be the best example, because if you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you actually have to do slightly different variations. I think Mark has, you are the Christ. Matthew has, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. I'd probably want to suggest that that's a translation difference, where depending on your culture and your audience, you explain the Christ is the Son of God or stuff like this rather than that. But yeah. And so they've said that's sort of a better model for how the oral tradition would go. One of the contributions my book makes is I've actually suggested that there's not in fact three, but there's a fourth model. And that's probably why I'm butchering, because the terms were informal, uncontrolled, formal, controlled, and then if you just do the other two options, I can't remember which is the one that they've suggested as the middle way and which is one I've suggested the other way, but one of them would be formal, uncontrolled, and the other one's informal, controlled. I'm just trying to remember which is the one I suggested and the one they suggested, but it's in the book. And so that's to say, the model I've suggested has been that, and I don't actually think that this is what the New Testament was done. My suggestion is that, in fact, the early Christian traditions were probably being passed on in all four categories. And I do suggest there is a fourth category. But then I say there are probably some people who were in Bart Ehrman's crazy telephone game that said this or that. Yep. And then there probably were some people, to say there were meant to be teachers in the early church, and I think they were, in some degrees, in for certain things in that formal, controlled way. And there were some other parts which I don't think we necessarily have verbatim. And in part, that's because I'd say studies have shown that people can only do verbatim around about 30 words. And so if you've got something like this prodigal son, which I don't know how many words are off the top of my head, but if I was just to guess it, it's probably in the order of 200. So yeah, it may be a hard case to say that was purely formal there, maybe in the middle. But then I would say the relevant question is, so where would the Gospels fall in that spectrum? And I do not think there would be the telephone game-like explanation for them. They're much more likely to be either that sort of formal one or perhaps that informal. And it may even depend on which part of the Gospels. So it's not just a whole blanket thing. Be for like certain things, like that saying I said, like, in Mark 8, where they ask who is Jesus and who do the people say he is, and they say, you are the Christ. Like, I think we probably do likely have the formal exact thing for that phrase as an example. Yeah, so that's how I would sort of explain it. And then my use would be in the case in the creed. I also think that is like a formal, exact thing that we have. Yep, sorry, long answer to that. And I guess if you'd like, so I did bring up before the story of the woman caught in adultery, let he is without sin cast the first stone. And so that may be a candidate for the more wild thing. And the reason I say that is because most scholars, and they could be wrong here, but do not think that was part of original John's Gospel, which is it was like a tradition that's floating around that was kind of popular and cool and got incorporated. But yeah, that. Or if you don't like that as an example, maybe perhaps some of the Gnostic scriptures or something like that. These are like other sort of vaguely Christian traditions that I think they were less concerned with like the historical facts of what happened. But yeah, that could be something in there. Yep, sorry. A question on this side, so thank you, Peter, for the microphone.
Just a thought in terms of how we view the validity of memory. If you're talking about a society where oral tradition was a much more stronger tradition in terms of remembering things, there wasn't a lot of written word, do you put more emphasis on the fact that if memory is considered like a muscle, the more you remember, the better you get at remembering, that there is more sort of reliability of people in the days when you had to remember things, that it's a more reliable source? For example, if I was asked to remember something, because I don't always rely on memory, I rely on my phone or written word, is my memory considered to be not as good as someone who would have relied on their memory all the time to have gotten through life?
Yes, yeah, thank you. That's a great point. And I basically do think that is valid, yes, which is to say, yes, they were oral cultures, they valued memory and stuff like that. So yes, that is important. And even today they do like memory competitions, and there's people who, I can't remember the exact amount, but like I said, people only do verbatim like 30-odd stuff. But there's people who remember like 1,000 digits of pi of just like random numbers, and they can do that like verbatim and stuff like that. So yes, there are great memory feats. On that note, I did say there was 21 factors. One of the factors which did not make it into the final cut was highly superior autobiographical memory. They do as an acronym. Yeah, and so there are cases of people who seem to just to have like superhuman memories, and there's, yep, and so to say they do exist, and so someone could argue that that was Paul or that was Luke, and so you can fully trust what he said because that. And I basically would point out to say that, yeah, if that was the case, then yes. But because we don't have necessarily any reason to think that was the case, I'm just going to assume like ordinary, average human memory and still say what can be said of that. And then my grounds, I'd say even ordinary human memory for like significant things like that, we could have confidence in it. One caution I would just want to give, and that is that the studies on that have sometimes said that, or people have said like these oral cultures, yeah, must all be like superhuman. And then what they've found is if you sort of record them and get to tell them again, they say they're saying it like exactly as it is, but in the sort of modern Western sense of verbatim, they're not. They're getting sort of that general gist. Yes, it is very accurate and reliable, but it is not like 1,000 words of accuracy in retelling the tale. And the other thing they've actually found is that actually modern people do have better memory than we think. It's just that we don't care in general as Westerners on the whole about our history and our traditions, and whereas these oral cultures, they do, and they sort of have that like story time, fire telling of our tribal traditions, is we care about other things like sport. And they would say like, you can ask people like, who are the players on this team? What are their scoring stats and stuff like this? And people, like, if you told that to those like tribal cultures, they'd be like, wow, no way. Like, you can remember like sports games and this and stuff like this. And so the studies have actually found like it's what we sort of give our attention to rather than they had superhuman abilities and stuff like that. But I still do in general agree, like the whole idea of it's a muscle that you do that and you practice it. I think, yeah, that there's something to that as well. And the studies would bear that out. It's a good point. Yep. Oh, yep. Happy to take questions. I do feel like we'll probably do the last one because otherwise we'll be suffering putting through. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much for what you have presented to us. It seems to me that a number of discourses keep overlapping. Psychology through memory, examination of the kind you've undertaken, but also the plausibility of the way people report things. You wouldn't usually perhaps expect people to report things that reflect badly on them. And yet there's this very big anomaly that Jesus was predicting clearly before his resurrection, that he would be crucified and raised. And right up to the point where the disciples were ready to see him ascend after the resurrection, they're saying, will you restore the kingdom and conquer the enemy? Having totally not got clear in their own heads what he'd been talking about for the whole of the 3 years of the coming eternal life and perspective of the Christian faith. Would they have reported that if they were wanting to develop a good reputation for the contribution they were making to the promulgation of the faith? But it's there, and all the weaknesses come through of the disciples and how long it took them to take on board what Jesus was telling them and what was happening around them. So that, in a way, straight biblical exegesis, being honest about how they reflected badly on what they themselves were doing with the evidence, is one of the things that makes the Christian message a strong one, because it's saying there were more factors at work than just human invention to bring this report down to us in the present day. So what you say about memory is very helpful and interesting. It's coming more from the psychological but also partly historical angle. If you came in through a more objective, can I put it that way, I'm not sure, angle, you might say, well, how about the legal mind that some authors have applied and it's been scoffed at, even such a book as Morrison's Who Moved the Stone, or who's the London man? Never mind.
That's right. I can tell you, memory of names is one of the things that people struggle with. There's no association with them. But, yep, it's a good point.
Yes, dear, can't pull down the London man. Empty tomb or something was his book.
Yep.
Spent time in Israel, in Jerusalem in particular. Went back to London, principal of the Theological College. Who am I talking about? That's where I'm at anyway. It wouldn't be much use for me to come on site with those who defend memory, not at this stage of my life.
That's right. No, thank you. It's a great comment. And I'm in the same boat. I couldn't even remember my... Actually, I do have it here now. So if you like, the third way I was saying, that middle way, is informal controlled. And then the fourth way that I suggested, which like one of the examiners may have said I had, 3 or 4 good points type of thing, and this was one of them. So hopefully it has some significance, but I can't remember it myself. And the fourth way was formal uncontrolled. But yeah, I struggle as well. But yeah, I think I hand over. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this is useful. I'm happy to stay around and chat further if you have questions.
Yeah, so thank you, David. Thanks for all your questions, and do want to thank you for leaving us the notes, because there's so much great content in your talk. We can go back and review it again, which I certainly will do. But at least I'm coming away with a some warm fuzzy feelings, as I do from most of these talks, but I'm really glad that you concluded that through all this research, the credibility of the Gospel accounts and Paul's accounts are very high. Great, excellent. And it also gives me a warm fuzzy feeling that there's so many people doing so much incredibly detailed and scholarly work sort of in the background, which all goes to support and increase the strength of the foundations of our faith, which I think is wonderful. And thank you for being a part of that work, David, and for sharing it with us this evening.